Welcome to another episode of Curiosities. I'm your host, Sylvie Sinclair. Grab yourself a nice hot tea and get comfy while we explore allegedly true accounts of the unexplained. Now, I don't pick just any story that I come across. Anyone can concoct an unexplainable encounter, and there's quite a lot of incentive to do so. The stories that interest me the most are the ones that have more than one witness that can corroborate the events. They're average, everyday people that don't have some shady history. They aren't people who seek out the paranormal, and they aren't anonymous. They're willing to put their names and faces out there to share their story. For today's story, I was lucky enough to get in contact with one of the key witnesses, and he gave me some fascinating extra details that weren't included in the Paranormal Witness episode called The Cabin, where their story was first brought to a wider audience. So without further ado, I'm going to read you the allegedly true story about how a family was stalked by a terrifying, unknown creature from the woods over a span of several months. Husband and wife, Keith and Diane, grew up in the small town of London, Ohio. In 1981, they had just purchased a cabin right at the edge of town next to the forest. Diane had grown up in the country all her life. Her family are avid hunters, same for Keith, and she wasn't the nervous type, so it was perfect for them. However, due to Keith working all day combined with night school, she and Raven would be left alone there for at least 12 hours a day. But it wasn't like they were completely secluded. They did have two neighbors nearby. One night after Diane had put Raven to bed, she was in the kitchen doing some dishes, when suddenly, she hears some scampering noises coming from outside. She tried to look out the window but didn't see anything, so she figured it had to be some dog or wild animal and didn't think much of it. Then, the sounds got stranger. She thought to herself, "This doesn't sound like any animal I've heard before. Something is off here." She looks outside again, and a pair of eyes pop up in the distance. She still thought, maybe it's just a dog that had gotten loose, so she heads into the dining room to clean the table, and when she looked up at the window, there it is, at the window staring at her. But this time, she realizes this thing is at eye level, meaning this could be a person stalking her. What else could possibly be at eye level doing this, she thought. She panicked, quickly closed the curtains, backed into the living room, and there it is again, at another window, up close. It's definitely stalking her. She's terrified, probably thinking there's someone outside my house about to break in, and I'm all alone with my kids sleeping upstairs. What is this person trying to do? Finally, Keith arrives home, and she tells him everything. He goes out to search the area with a flashlight and finds nothing. No tracks, no evidence of anything being there. He regrets this, but he told her it must be her nerves or a reflection in the window, that there's no way it could have been anything, because he found nothing. About 1 month later, after putting their daughter Raven to bed, Diana is downstairs in the kitchen cleaning up just like before, and when she looks up at the window, there it is. This time, the eyes were right up at the window, at eye level, staring at her. Her heart started racing. She's horrified. She slowly backed away from the window to get out of its sight, but it followed her to another window. She couldn't see it very well due to having lights on inside while it's dark outside. Then she thought to herself, I could try turning out all of the lights so they can't see me, but maybe I could get a better look at them. Scared for her life, she quickly ran to turn them off. And that's when she saw it. A face in the window, the height of a tall human, standing there, staring at her. She runs away from its view and immediately calls the police, telling them that there's a man outside her house. Then she runs to her daughter's room and barricades the door. As they wait for the police to return, Diane was able to hear it walk around to the back of the house. Eventually, the police arrive and search the property. They find nothing. And that's when Keith pulls up. The cops told him they think it must have been her nerves, and once again, Keith agrees and assumes his wife is imagining things out of fear. Keith was upset with her at this point, which he very much regrets. Then about 4 months later, Keith wakes up early before daylight in late November. Fresh snow everywhere, as it was the first snow of the year. He thought it would be really nice to get some warm donuts for his family to wake up to. As he starts his car, he rubs his eyes while looking in the rearview mirror. He rubs his eyes again, turns on the car, the lights go on, he starts to back up, and that's when he saw it. Surprisingly, the show didn't even include the description of what he saw, but thankfully I was able to ask him myself, and when I spoke to him, even after all these years, he said it was still clear in his mind that he'd never forget it. It was a 7-foot-tall creature looking around the corner at him. In his words, it resembled an ancient Egyptian god, that dog-like creature with ears pointing straight up, similar to a Doberman. It was gone in a flash. It all happened very quickly, so he wondered if it had just been his imagination. That is, until daylight came. He went outside to have a look around. Nothing was there until he looked up at the roof, and there on the awning were clear footprints in the snow heading onto the roof. Now he believes his wife. About 2 hours later, he calls up his old friend and hunting buddy, Dennis, that he's known all his life. Dennis shows up, sees the tracks, and says, "What the hell is this?" The footprints weren't human, but also didn't match any animal they could think of. They were huge, about 14 inches long, and had claw marks at the end, and it was clear that it was walking on 2 feet. The tracks had shown that the creature had leapt off of the roof and landed over 20 feet away in their yard. Nothing could do that. Keith and Dennis have hunted every type of animal in those woods, and they had never seen any tracks remotely like it. So they're thinking, what the hell was this thing, and why is it stalking them? Keith told me the snow was starting to melt at that point, so they had to act quickly. He didn't feel like he could rely on the police to follow up on this, and he knew them personally. He said he had to act on his own to protect his family from danger. He was chilled to the bone thinking about what could happen to his family while he's not there. The men wasted no time, grabbed their hunting rifles, and immediately set off into the forest to track down and potentially kill whatever beast had been stalking them. Moving through the woods and tracking animals was second nature to these two. They've been hunters and trappers all their lives, and they've seen everything in these woods, except for what they were about to encounter. Not long into their search, they came upon the same tracks heading into the forest filled with thick brush that kept them from seeing past a few feet in front of them. Every time they would stop to listen, they heard nothing out of the ordinary. They were able to follow the tracks for about 2 miles deep into the forest. Suddenly, they hear it running, and it was fast. Their hearts are pounding as they chase after it. They had a bit of fear, but mostly anticipation of the encounter. They chased it all the way back to a clearing at the edge of the woods. And all that was there was a very small cabin. It was about 15 to 18 feet wide by 20. A very small dwelling. On the ground, they could see the strange tracks leading straight to the back door. But the door was shut. They were shocked because animals don't open and shut doors. Up until that point, they still had thought it could be some strange creature no one had seen before. Dennis starts to beat on the house, shouting to come out. There was no answer. Keith was worried because this looked pretty bad for them. They're banging on someone's house, potentially with people inside, while holding guns. Eventually, they leave, but they didn't want to walk down the road with the guns. So Keith calls his dad to come pick them up. Keith explained to him what had happened, and his dad pauses to think for a moment, then says he thinks he knows who lives in that cabin. Some old guy working in a tire shop in town. Apparently, he's lived there for decades and no one knows anything about him. He's a complete mystery. Keith didn't know what to make of it. Is this guy living with some strange creature that's stalking his family? Did it break into his house to hide from them? Later that week, Dennis shows up with an old tire, asking Keith to come with him to get a look at this guy. Once they get to the shop, they hand the tire over to the owner and he shouts for his employee. "George, tire." The man walks out. He was tall, about 6'5", lanky, with very long arms. An older guy, around the age of 60. And right as he grabs the tire, he locks eyes with Keith and Dennis. They immediately felt a connection. They felt their intuition telling them strongly that this George guy knew exactly who they were. This was the guy. But something was off. His eyes were intense and a very vivid gold. As they waited, they hear the tire pop. Then complete silence. Soon after, the tire rolls out on its own all the way across the building floor. So this guy had to be very strong. They got the impression that George at that point was trying to avoid them. They grabbed the tire and put it in the truck. That's when they see it. A series of symbols marked in chalk all around the tire. It didn't look like anything they had seen before. Of course, they couldn't understand what it meant, but they could tell he was trying to give them a message. I asked Keith about the symbols, and he said they thought they were just chalk scratches, but someone later on pointed out that they might be like symbols or potentially runes, and sadly there was no picture of it. At this point, they couldn't really call the police. There was no proof of anything, and it would look worse on them for potentially chasing a man to his house with guns. He didn't tell his wife because he knew she'd freak out, and they didn't have the resources to move yet. So he suggested to invite her sister over while she's alone. At that point, the situation was really hitting him hard. He worried for his family's safety, and it ate at him that he may not be there to protect them if something more happened. But there wasn't much of an option. During this time, Keith told me that Diane's sister was there once and heard the trash can get thrown against the house, halfway up the side and slamming onto the driveway. And they could see the trash can spinning there on the ground. Her sister immediately called the police, but they said it was probably just the wind. Keith said there was no way it could have been the wind. The trash can was at the side of the house, but it was thrown at the back of the house. And they don't have bears in that area of Ohio. Keith also told me that around this time, the mayor's wife was attacked in her car while driving down a road about 2 miles from their house. The back door of her car was badly damaged, and again, they didn't have bears in that area, so what could it have been? I asked him if either of his neighbors had any strange experiences, and he was told by a third party that someone who used to live 2 doors down had his back deck mysteriously torn off and destroyed. But that didn't make it into the show because it couldn't be verified due to that neighbor passing away. Another guy told him years later that him and his brother hit a huge black dog just past where they lived. It damaged the front of his pickup truck, and it took off on 2 legs after getting hit. Okay, back to Keith and Diane. Eventually, they were able to move and not worry so much anymore. But there was still this lingering desire for an answer, some kind of closure to this mystery. About a year later, Keith gets a phone call. It was Dennis calling to inform him that this George guy had just passed away, and he wanted Keith to come with him to check out the mysterious cabin. As they arrived, there was a deputy there that they happened to be friends with. He immediately says to them, "You guys have to see this." They couldn't wait to get some answers, so they rushed inside. The home had literally no clothing, no food, no personal items. Nothing told them anything about who or what had been living there. But there was a strange metal door. They open it up. And they get a huge whiff of nasty, pungent, wet dog smell. But even stranger, it was a small room completely encased in steel plates held together with metal strips and rivets. Then they see the chains. About a 10-foot strip of chains. It was clear to them that something had been restrained back there. They inspected the walls closer, and there were scratches everywhere, like some beast had been clawing the walls to death. And some of them were so old, they had rusted over. Neither of them said a word, but they were all thinking the same thing about what this could have been. I asked Keith more about the property, and he explained that it had been a check station for an old turn-of-the-century clay tile company. Some of the kilns were still standing. There were still wagon ruts that ran in front of it where they could check the horse-drawn wagons in and out, which was before iron or PVC was in use. The place did have running water and a facility. The metal room was an old cash room where the clerk would keep money. In the early days of the 20th century, the public still used coins a lot when paper money wasn't trusted just yet. So we have an explanation for the metal-encased room, but they never found out what had been chained there. After George had passed, the stalking had stopped, and he only left behind a jar of silver dollars, and he was buried locally in an unmarked grave. The silver dollars probably had nothing to do with the paranormal. I know it's commonly associated with werewolf lore, but back then Keith said lots of older people kept silver dollars. I asked Keith if he had ever gotten to hear about the cause of death. He said he had looked into it, but found nothing. It was a small town with one local doctor, and maybe one assistant that investigates the deaths. And if there's no sign of foul play, that's it. If you have no relatives that want answers, you just get buried. They see no need to spend county money taking it any further. If you were homeless or not of any prominence, then nobody cared. Keith felt it was sad and indecent. He wound up asking around town about George, trying to get some answers. His boss at the tire place only hired him part-time when they needed extra help, and he would pay in cash. The only thing that he knew about him was that he would never walk down the street. He only ever walked on the railroad tracks from one end of town to the other. His closest neighbor told Keith that she had seen him but assumed he was homeless. She didn't even know that he had been living there, and the other people living nearby had never spoken to him. Keith told me that the terror from that time changed him forever. He now looks deep into the shadows at night whenever he goes outside or gets out of his car. There is now that little thing that's always there in his mind that's saying, "Beware of what's in the dark." Now I'm sure you're wondering, were Keith and Diane the only ones that saw this strange creature in that area? Back then, especially, and remember, this story took place in the early 80s, no one would have believed something like this. They would have been labeled liars or crazy, so I'm guessing most of the sightings weren't reported. But there were actually many reports with the same description in the Ohio and Michigan area, dating all the way back to 1887, and some as recent as 2016, and probably more, I just can't find them. The encounters and descriptions have multiple similarities to what Keith and Diane had described, such as the beast being around 7 feet tall, glowing gold eyes, giant muscular body, walking on 2 feet with dark fur, a Doberman-like head, and wicked fast, with the ability to leap a distance of like 10 to 20 feet. One difference I did notice between the sightings were the fur coats, suggesting that these creatures aren't all the same. And their behavior is kind of interesting. Based on the many reports I've read, they don't seem to be that interested in killing or harming people. I wouldn't doubt that they have killed people before, but based on the reports, usually they're seen either hunting an animal, eating one, running or jumping across the street, staring at people or stalking them, but not attacking anyone. Despite the many sightings over the years, no one really knows for sure what these creatures are or where they came from. Whether it was a man-made hybrid, an undiscovered canine species, an alien, a demon, something coming from another dimension similar to what might be happening at Skinwalker Ranch, or, as many think, potentially a person that's able to transform into this creature. We can only hope that the truth will soon become known, and that the many people who have been haunted by these encounters will find the answers they need.